Thank you for staying around for hour two. And what we're going to talk about here is more books that will be useful in coalescing and understanding of what I talked about in relationship to Isaiah and the coming of the Messiah. And then the Nietzsche argument and the response and the questions of God's existence. Can God's existence be proven and known with certainty? Is that possible? How do we view that? One book I would well, actually, I have three books, and yeah, these are a little bit long, but it's up to you. Do you want to get into this or not? If you do, and again, this is a question that keeps coming up, so this is really directed to the people who are very interested in this topic, the New Testament, the veracity of the New Testament, and so forth. How do we understand the apocalyptic texts, and do they actually present a powerful testament to the veracity of the Bible? I think that they do. So one book that's really good is Days of Vengeance, and this is a very in-depth commentary on the Apocalypse of John. And this writer, although he unfortunately died very young, David Chilton, somewhat young, it was coming at this period when he wrote this towards orthodoxy. I don't know the whole story of what happened to him and his death, but regardless, that book is very good in showing the apocalyptic texts are actually talking about the end of the Old Covenant period in 70 AD. Many of them, not all of them, right? Full preterism, as it's called, would be a heresy. We don't believe that. The way that it's dealt with in the Orthodox Study Bible is excellent. The commentary in the Apocalypse in the Orthodox Study Bible is great. If you want to go deeper, I do recommend David Chilton's book, Days of Vengeance. Another great book that makes a lot of the same points that I've been making in this talk is Milton Terry's book, Biblical Apocalyptics. This is a very in-depth scholarly study of the subject of apocalyptics and how a lot of it is seen to be fulfilled in the first advent of the Messiah. Not all, but some. Another great book that is actually a THD thesis, one of the books that I read early on that really convinced me of this point was Dr. Ken Gentry's book, Before Jerusalem Fell. I made copious notes in that one. In fact, I think I sat in my chair and read it straight for like 2 days. So I highly recommend that one. You can't beat that one in terms of the dating of the Apocalypse of John. So those are some good routes to go down if you want to get clearer on the transition from the time of the Old Testament to the New. Another important thing that's overlooked that a lot of people aren't aware of is the books of the Maccabees, particularly First and Second Maccabees, which are in the Orthodox Study Bible. Part of the reason why we have a different canon from Protestants. I'm more and more, as I get older, come to see the importance of the Maccabees and how the Maccabean family and the revolt of the Maccabees is crucial to understanding this time period between the Old and the New Testament. So what you have there is an instantiation of the abomination of desolation, which Jesus refers to in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, prophesied in Daniel 7 and 9. And so you have, in other words, mirrored patterns of fulfillment over time of this kind of a thing, of the desecration of the worship of God, of the holy place, and so forth by idolatry. Jesus says in Luke 21 that abomination that his disciples will see, right, will happen to the temple in their day. And Jesus says that the temple will be destroyed, right? So this occurs in 70 AD, and that is the fulfillment of the prophecies of the end of the old covenant, right? And then the coming of the new covenant, as Jeremiah talked about, and as we read in the text in Isaiah. So all of that is a very powerful testament to the truth of Christianity that is missed by a lot of these people because they're not aware of that, especially the people that I mentioned earlier, the Bart Ehrmans, the Elaine Pagels, and the people that are making these kind of goofy arguments. Jesus never existed and all this kind of stuff. If you understand these perspectives, it's a powerful testament to the veracity of the New Testament text. And the New Testament text and their veracity cannot be understood apart from the Old Testament text and their veracity. That is key. That is crucial. And once you understand that, it refutes these goofy arguments that we've been talking about from all these people. It also refutes the Joe Atwell type of argument that that this was a Flavian conspiracy on the part of certain Roman and wealthy families, and the Jewish Josephus theory, right? That Josephus is some kind of messianic character, or he thought that Titus was the Messiah, and all this nonsense. None of that's true. That's all goofy. And again, you go the route of what I'm talking about, and you'll understand that's why that's the case. So those are some basics. I'm not saying that's the total argument. I'd have to do like a whole lecture series on the New Testament and the Septuagint, the Old Testament, to really give every argument. But that's a good introduction to these questions of textual studies, church history, church fathers, why I believe in these things, why I think there's a lot of testament to their veracity. But none of those are ultimately the proofs for God, right? Those are separate questions. So how do we know who God is and whether God exists? Well, let's start with the question of the Nietzschean opponent. Well, one of the guys who's a reader and a listener to my stuff, he sent me a question and said, if you've read Nietzsche, Ecce Homo, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, if you've read Antichrist, which I've read most of these Nietzschean writings. I haven't read every single Nietzsche book, but I've read 3 or 4 of the main ones. So I get the idea. Beyond Good and Evil, I've read that one too. So I know where Nietzsche's coming from. I understand the argument. I've read the aphorisms. So Nietzsche talks about the idea that what we really have is the idea of the dominance of elites and weaker people, right? And that the ideas of what is vulgar and what is common, that's connected to morality, and that is tied up with the people who were the elites, and that they kind of snub their nose at the ideas of the skanky people out there in the street. And that's also tied to how we get the ideas of being sophisticated, being genteel, and not being vulgar and common. So Nietzsche sees morality as being the same kind of thing as that. And that's how it evolves in history and in time and in cultures and civilizations. So when he looks at Christianity, he sees it as this very weak thing, that it only appeals to the weaker elements of society, the weaker aspects of man's nature. It's a slave morality, in other words. It only appeals to the weak social justice warrior type. It only appeals to the weak gay male. It only appeals to the single mom, right? The kind of person that we would think is weak, as opposed to the noble, valiant Nordic warrior or the Roman emperor or something like this. Well, the first thing I would say is that I would do a presuppositional critique of Nietzsche's position. I would say Nietzsche's position eschews the ideas of objective truth. It laughs at that as Platonic and weak. And the idea of a morality being imposed upon someone else. But if that's true, if that's the case, then Nietzsche is imposing a morality upon me, namely the Nietzschean Übermensch morality, right? That I should reject his conception of the master-slave morality is itself an imposition of a worldview of morality upon me. And in Nietzsche's mind, only weak people have moralities imposed upon them. In Nietzsche's mind, there's no universal truths. There's no objective truths. So in other words, Nietzscheanism just falls back into a kind of pragmatism, a kind of nihilism, the will to power and all that. There's nothing in will to power that can give an account for the good. And Nietzsche rejects the idea of the good. The good is merely what the powerful kind of make it to be. Nietzsche's position, again, still relies on universal principles and objective principles and truths that make his position impossible. So it's not really on its own grounds a coherent worldview for criticizing or rejecting any worldview. Because just like Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, Sartre says that anybody who has a morality that is imposed upon them is a slave. Right? He talks about bad faith and all that. Well, if I accept Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, then I've had a person argue and impose a position upon me that I should accept, right? How am I not still operating in bad faith? How am I not still a slave? Same with Nietzsche. There's no such thing as a completely individualized position. That doesn't exist, right? I mean, if I just sit here all day and read philosophy and read Nietzsche, and then I come away from that thinking I'm beyond good and evil and all this stuff, that wasn't my philosophy. I'm just rehashing Nietzsche. So I'm just another kind of slave. So what all Nietzsche's philosophy is just kind of an appeal to the ego. It's an appeal to the pride of man, that you think you're going to be, better than everybody, and you may actually be better than everybody at some things, but you're still a man. You're still finite. You're still human. You're not the Ubermensch, right? You're not the God man. So it's really a delusional kind of philosophy and very contradictory. But Nietzsche really doesn't have a problem with contradictions because, again, it's a relativistic kind of philosophy, just as existentialism is, right? And of course, Nietzsche influences existentialism. So, there's not really any substance to those views. I mean, again, who are the Nietzscheans? They're college kids. It's a phase you go through when you're 17, 20, whatever. Just like Ayn Rand, objectivism, you think you've got it all figured out because you read, Ayn Rand or something. Those are phases. They're not real. They don't provide a worldview. And I think that's the power, part of the power and force of the argument for Orthodox theology, is that it does give a worldview. Now, you may not like it, you may not want it, you may reject it. That's your will doing that. That's your will to do that if you choose to. But it does provide a worldview. It does give coherence and meaning, and it at least gives a foundation for understanding knowledge and epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics, right? These are the three branches that make up what we call as philosophy, historically, at least in the West, and basically in the East, Far East too. So a worldview, that's the way that I'm going to critique opposing positions, opposing arguments. That's the way that I'm going to come against anything like Nietzscheanism or atheism or any of that stuff, is that I'm going to look at its worldview, what it has to offer, and see if it can give a coherent account, a coherent basis for these typical things that make up a worldview or a philosophy. And again, what are these three? Knowledge or epistemology, how we know things about the world. Metaphysics, right? What's real, what's not real, what exists, what doesn't. And ethics, what's right, what's wrong, virtue, vice, right? So this makes up the worldview, and I'm going to, in the process of my argument for God, I'm going to look at these different positions that come at me, and I'm going to see, can they give an account, right? Because they're going to try to trip up, theists or Christianity or the idea of God's existence without considering their assumptions. And so that's what presuppositionalism is that it's really a matter of questioning our assumptions because we interpret the world through these paradigms. And until we question the paradigms, we're always going to read the facts, so-called, or the evidences, so-called, in our favor. And that's because we kind of have glasses that we're reading the world through, which is our paradigm or worldview. And we can maybe even construct a vast house of cards edifice that might get some things right on faulty assumptions, paradigms, or presuppositions. So what we want to do is look at the starting point in the atheist worldview, in the Nietzschean worldview, whatever it may be, and see if it's coherent and consistent. Because if they're arguing, if they're debating, they're assuming common laws of logic and rationality and consistency and coherency. They're coming to the table, they're entering the game, assuming that in some way is proper and will guide our debate. If they don't believe in logic, laws, and consistency, then they can't come to the debate. They can't argue for their position being right and theism being wrong. So once they've entered into the debate, they've already acquiesced to the existence of real logical laws and principles that bind all of us, or at least us in the debate, right? So that's going to be the real stickler, though. This is where we're going to critique their position and tear it apart ultimately. And we're going to show that on their position, knowledge is impossible. On their position, metaphysics is nonsense. They're going to assume metaphysical truths in the midst of denying metaphysical truths. They're going to contradict at a very powerful fundamental level. Devastating level. We're going to see that their ethics is incoherent and inconsistent. That they can't provide a coherent belief or basis or foundation for ethics. And that is going to be the three aspects of their worldview, their philosophy, and we're going to see that their account is completely irrational, completely incoherent, completely contradictory, completely nonsensical, and can't even get off the ground, can't even begin to make arguments, can't even begin to make meaningful conversation on their grounds, if their worldview is correct, as they try to argue against theism. And as a result, that's going to be my argument, a reductio argument, an argument from the impossibility of the contrary, a transcendental argument, to show that my position is the only one that can actually give a coherent account for how we have knowledge of the external world, how we have knowledge and experience of metaphysical principles and realities, and we know what's out there in the world and don't know what's out there. How we have an account of what's right and wrong, virtue and vice. All right, so we're going to compare paradigms. As long as we're trying to spit facts, quote unquote, back and forth, you're not going to get anywhere. It's not going to do anything. Why? Because facts are not brute. There's no brute fact that doesn't come as part of some context of interpretation. There's no such thing as a brute fact. That's an Enlightenment idea that doesn't exist. That's an aspect of scientism that doesn't, there's no such thing. So if there's no brute facts, how are we going to debate? How are we going to argue? Well, we're going to compare, as I said, these worldviews, these paradigms, and we're going to see which one actually is coherent and sensible, the only position that's coherent and sensible, and which one is just complete, utter nonsense and contradicts at the outset. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use not so much Nietzscheanism, because not as many people are familiar with that, but something more like the New Atheists or the atheistic materialism. We're going to use that as a test case, an example case, because it's also very popular with Dawkins and all these characters out there. Sam Harris and Hitchens and Hawking Dawkins for all these years. So that's a little more relevant, and it's a very easy test case, blatant way to knock down that kind of a position, which is very popular, amazingly. It's total philosophical nonsense, but we're going to see that. But very popular because, again, most of this kind of stuff is spread through slogans and emotional propaganda, and through public education, through Hollywood, through movies, through Discovery Channel, that kind of stuff. Star Trek. This is much more influential in terms of indoctrinating people into things like reductionistic materialism and mystical evolution than actual science, quote unquote, or philosophical investigation or rigorous, robust analytical analysis. That really has nothing to do with why most people accept these views. So let's get into it then. Let's say that I'm going to encounter in a sort of fantastical debate here, mythical, fictional debate here, the atheistic materialist, and how am I going to prove God in this case? How am I going to give a certain proof for the existence of God, and not just any God, right? Not generic theism, but specifically my God, right? The God of the Bible, that God. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at that guy's position, and we're going to say, what do you have to offer here? What are you bringing to the table in the debate when you present your position, your worldview, up against my worldview? Now, you're going to say mine's, the mean, evil God, flying spaghetti monster. You figured this out when you were in your mom's basement eating the Hot Pockets and slurping ramen noodles and playing Call of Duty and all this kind of stuff, and you had a mystical vision where your neck beard talked to you, and you and your beard got into a conversation, and your beard revealed to you that Darwin was true. I'm joking, but so let's say you're going to bring your worldview to me. So let's look at the atheistic materialist worldview as it relates to knowledge, epistemology, how we know things, their worldview as it relates to metaphysics and what exists, what doesn't, and their worldview as it relates to ethics and claims about morals and right and wrong. So how am I going to critique the atheist perspective here? And let's just set aside Nietzsche for a moment and again go to the new atheist, the reductionist and materialist as a test case example. So this guy's going to come to me and he's going to argue that there's no good proof for God's existence. There's no way to know. Evolution is a much more likely explanation for man and man's origins. And he's going to say things like, for example, in terms of epistemology, how we know things, he's going to say, we can only trust what we know from our five senses, sense data, that's it. That's the most reliable way to interpret the world and understand the world. That's really all we can know in some probabilistic statistical sense. There's no absolute certainty. Nothing is absolutely universally certain. No universal claims are possible. We can only kind of have approximations, right? Bertrand Russell says this multiple times in Scientific Outlook and in his other books, his logic books as well. So that's where he's going to come from in terms of epistemology. Metaphysics, he's going to say that we don't do that anymore. We're going to toss that out. There's no such thing as metaphysics. But reality is basically just matter. That's a metaphysical claim, by the way. So that's what he's generally going to say. This matter is in a constant, perpetual evolutionary flux. That's usually what they're going to say too. From that, we're going to discuss. Then he's going to move to ethics, and he's going to say probably something like, ethics is we look to humanism, some form of secular humanism, maybe the Humanist Manifesto. These are the new ways to come up with some ethics, right? Or some maybe a social what's socially agreed upon, right? So this is his answer. This is his perspective. This is what he has to offer. And again, I've had probably 100 iterations of this same debate. So how am I going to refute that? How am I going to prove God's existence? Well, first, what I want to do is point out that, as I've said in many talks, the argument is a transcendental argument. It's a real logical form. It's a type of argument first given in Aristotle. Aristotle, when he's presented with the sophist argument, the sophists come to him and they were the relativists of their day. They say, Aristotle, how can you know that the laws of logic are true? Playing the skeptic, the sophist says, Aristotle, you talk a lot of good game here with your logic, but what if I don't accept logic? What if I doubt the laws of logic? And I think that there's no such thing as the law of non-contradiction, Aristotle. Aristotle replies by saying, I can refute that. Now, the way that I'm going to refute it is not empirical, because the subject matter under discussion here, the laws of logic themselves, are not empirical. So the way that I'm going to refute that is, because it's a meta-empirical claim or a meta-logical claim, I'm going to refute it meta-logically. And he gives a transcendental argument. He says that the way that I know, Sophist, that your argument is false is precisely because in the very act of rejecting the laws of logic, you're assuming logic. You're coming into a debate assuming public, common, universal, immaterial, invariant laws of logic in the process of denying and saying that they don't exist. You're saying that it's illogical to believe in laws of logic. That is a contradiction, right? And so to point that out assumes laws of logic, which is the very thing that you're trying to deny. That's a very basic, very simple presuppositional argument. It's a reductio, right? It's an argument from the impossibility of the contrary. The argument says and shows that on your grounds, there's no such thing as laws of logic or argumentation or debate at all. So you can't even argue against the laws of logic. As soon as you do, you refute yourself. Because to argue against a law of logic assumes a law of logic. So Aristotle gives a transcendental argument. And this is in his Metaphysics. So this is not a new idea. A transcendental argument is later picked up in the Orthodox Church Father, St. John of Damascus. He gives a transcendental argument for God's existence. You can see that in my talk that I gave on the Logos and the Logoi. In his writings, his philosophical chapters, Kant tries to give versions of this, not for God, but for other things. But Kant's arguments aren't very good because he doesn't believe that the transcendentals apply to actually existing things in the world. He just thinks it's all kind of mental crap. So I don't rely on Kant. I'm not going to Kant for any of this stuff. This is separate from Kant. I think there's some insights in Kant, but we're not going there. Then it's later picked up by modern theologians, linguists. Carl Otto Appel gives some interesting transcendental arguments in regards to language. Dr. Greg Bahnsen, as an apologist, gives transcendental arguments. Cornelius Van Til, right? So, and there's other people who engage in transcendental argumentation as well. There's one guy at Oxford or Cambridge. He's a very, very well-known linguistic philosopher, but his name escapes me at the moment. Anyway, separate issue. Point being, here we're looking at the apologetic use of transcendental argumentation. And so in the case of the atheist who's just presented his materialist worldview, what we're doing is we're going to compare the paradigms, as I said, and see which one can actually give an account for these basic principles that are necessary for their preconditions for knowledge at all, right? We're going to be looking for the preconditions and possibilities for even having knowledge, right? Before we try to get into actual empirical claims of knowledge and what the atheist thinks he knows and this and that, we're going to step back and say, hey, whoa, slow down. Let's step back here and see, does your position even give the possibility for knowledge at all? Okay? That's why this is so devastating once you grasp it, right? That's why this completely destroys that paradigm once you grasp the argument. And it is a logical argument. That's what I'm trying to say, too. I mean, in other words, the atheists might reject it. They might say, I don't believe any of that. Your argument's no good. Doesn't matter, right? I mean, that's just, this is something that they're always saying, right? Science is true whether you believe in it or not. Well, laws of logic hold whether you accept my argument or not, right? So a transcendental argument is a actual logical proof and form, right? Read Aristotle's Metaphysics, whether you accept it or not. And I'm not appealing to Aristotle as a appeal to authority. These arguments objectively stand on their own, right? I mean, you can intuitively, immediately see that to deny a law of logic assumes logic. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to this guy, and his argument is, as we said, first in epistemology, right? The three branches of philosophy. In his worldview, he says that knowledge is empirical. We can only know what we know through our sense data. Very easy to refute this and show this to be total nonsense and total contradiction. First of all, the claim itself that we only know things through sense data is not something that you can learn through sense data. No amount of sense data can tell you that universal proposition that we only know things through sense data. Secondly, if we only know the things that we know through pure sense data, pure empirical data, right? Psychologism, logical positivism, naive empiricism, that's what this view is called. Well, we're led to immediately a host of stupid positions. First of which is that you, as a self, making these so-called arguments, these bad arguments, you don't have an empirical experience of the self. So you can't verify your existence. Stupid. You can't verify that you existed in the past 10 years ago. You can't verify empirically that it's the same you from 10 years ago that is the dude today. How can you empirically verify that? You can't. But you have a presupposition of the existence of yourself over time, right? Something that's not empirically verified, right? And these are warranted rational beliefs, yet they're immaterial truths. The self is not a material empirical proof, right? But it's rational to believe in it by the mere fact of entering into meaningful conversation, linguistics, language, and chat. It's assuming that there's some self that's conveying this meaning. You believe that that objects or persons have identity over time, is what I'm getting at here, right? But you can't empirically verify that objects have identity over time. Again, how do you know that you are the same you from 10 years ago? I mean, you believe that you are, but I'm not asking you, do you believe that you are? I'm asking you, what's your empirical proof for that? Now, it turns out there's a whole bunch of empirical of things that are believed that are not empirical, that you believe. Oh, oops, didn't realize that, did you? No, you didn't. So you can't come to me with this stupid assumption that we can only know what we know through empirical sense data, because there's all kinds of things that we all believe in that are not empirically demonstrable, that are perfectly rational to believe in. So how do we know they're true? Well, we know they're true because of the possibility of the contrary. If I doubt the existence of the self and deny the self, then I'm just basically into some kind of solipsism or some kind of Maya position. And if you believe that, then you've already surrendered the debate. You no longer believe in a common realm of logical argumentation. So you have to leave. You've lost the debate, right? You don't have an argument anymore, because argument assumes common laws of logic. Now, empirical sense data doesn't prove a law of logic. Empirical sense data can't verify reason. Empirical sense data cannot verify or prove mathematical entities or objects. You see, your position is starting to box itself into total absurdity. So that, I would say, I mean, we can keep going. There's a whole bunch more stupid things that you would believe in this position, but let's stop there and move to the metaphysics, right? So we're dealing with the three aspects of philosophy or worldview of the atheistic materialist. So let's look at his metaphysic. Now, his metaphysic is that there's no metaphysics, right? Metaphysics was tossed out because that was stupid medieval superstition, and we've had people like John Locke and Scientific Revolution and Newton and Galileo and Darwin have come along, and we don't need that crazy stuff anymore. Now, wait a minute. You've simultaneously, 90% of these people will say, all that exists is matter. Well, number one, that's a universal claim. How do you demonstrate a universal claim empirically? Have you read David Hume? You can't. You can't empirically demonstrate a universal claim. Universal claims assume universals. Oh, oops. Back to metaphysics, right? That's metaphysics. That's epistemology that you've rejected. Empiricism can't give you any universal claims. You can't, because you'd have to know all things. It's obvious. Quit being so stupid. Now, what about the metaphysical claim of perpetual flux and evolution? This is your view. Well, if everything is in perpetual flux and evolution, and most of these people are determinists, right? They don't believe in free will. Then the position that you came to in your mind was just a result of determined chemical process. It wasn't an actual self-consciousness freely, deliberating between positions and truth and coming to truthhood and falsehood through rationality. No, it was chaotic, meaningless, random process, right? And here again, let's refute this very quickly, very, very easily. You believe that the totality of reality is meaningless. It's just perpetual chaos and flux. That means that your life is perpetual chaos and flux. Determined chemical reaction is therefore meaningless. That means that your arguments are merely determined chemical process and reaction and therefore meaningless. That means that the sentences coming out of your mouth as you try to refute Christianity are, by your own admission, determined chemical process that is pure meaninglessness. So you've refuted yourself in the process of trying to refute Christianity. Let's talk about ethics. Ethics in this position is impossible because it wants to criticize Christianity. Oh, God's mean, right? Well, now wait a minute. For you to say that something is evil requires there to be some universal benchmark or standard by which you can say this is good, this is bad. In your position, however, there are no universal standards or claims. Everything is under the process of evolution that would include immaterial realities, invariant principles, laws, and moral claims are also evolutionary. How do you know that anything is evil? You can't, in other words, you may not like it, okay, but you have to understand that there's a difference between the claim of not liking something and the claim that something is morally wrong, right? One of them is a universal value judgment. The other one is just merely a matter of taste. So you, in your view, if I eat babies, you may not like that. Maybe you do like that. I don't know. It's a bunch of sickos. But there's nothing morally wrong with eating babies in your view. There's nothing morally wrong with genocide. And that's why something ridiculous like Humanist Manifesto or morals are social constructs and that's all nonsense, right? We can have a society. What if society declares that all atheists should be put to death, right? Well, you would say that's bad, but if your claim is that morals are just social constructs, you have no basis to say that's wrong. You might not like it, but you're not liking it really has nothing to do with right or wrong. Wait a minute. Remember what you guys always say, right? Science is true whether you like it or not. Well, guess what? Objective principles, right, are true whether you like them or not. Universal claims are true whether you like them or not. Moral claims, right, whether you like them or not, really has nothing to do. In other words, you have to be consistent. And the question is, are you going to be? And no, you're not. That's the thing, is that so far what we've seen here is a consistent philosophical gobbledygook garbage that is not consistent at all. So all of these things that you've tried to use, epistemic claims of certainty, of knowledge of laws of logic, of principles, objective, metaphysical, universal principles, these things can't exist on your view, or we have no way to know how that's even possible given all the garbage and gobbledygook of the other claims in your position. Things like, we only know empirical sense data. The metaphysic, right, which you claim there's no metaphysics at the same time as saying that all that exists is matter. That's a metaphysical claim. Universal metaphysical claim. How could you ever know that? It's impossible. All right. So, if you're reduced to pure skepticism, then you really can't logically debate, can you? As a skeptic, because you need some basis, some account. You're asking me as a theologian, as a Christian, to give an account for my views. I'm also asking you to give an account for your account is crazy talk. You might not like my account, but it's at least going to be coherent. I'm at least going to be able to give you a reasoned account and coherent view of my worldview, my paradigm. And again, look at the atheist regimes. Much as you hate all the Christian past, the atheist regimes are just brutal, man. All they do is just mass murder. So you want to talk about humanitarianism? The 20th century's examples of atheist regimes, you guys are just brutal maniacs. You lose your mind is what happens. And the Bible actually gives an account for that. It explains why atheist regimes and crazy people lose their mind and go nuts in mass murder, right? Soviet Union, Mao, right? So there's no ethical basis for secular humanism or reductionistic materialism. I mean, in every one of these atheists, by the way, if somebody murders their mom, they're going to be morally indignant, aren't they? Of course they are. If somebody steals their bank account, their identity, they're going to be mad. They're going to be pissed, indignant. They feel like they've been wronged. Well, excuse me. In your worldview, there's just my tastes. My taste is to take your bank account. Who are you to deny me my bank account? Appropriating your bank account. Again, so what if you don't like it, right? We're not talking about what you like or don't like. We're talking about right and wrong, right? Those are two different things. You have no basis, no moral benchmark to say that that's right, that's wrong, this is good, this is bad. Those are just tastes. My taste's your taste, bro. Different strokes for different folks, man. Every one of these atheists is going to go to a funeral. Most of them. Why are you going to a funeral? It's just natural process. Mourning? Mourning what? A meaningless life? That's stupid. So what we start to see is that these philosophical positions that people wear as a costume and pretend to be the strong, crazed, these brave atheists, right? So brave, man. They're not actually that brave. They're pretending, right? Because they're not going to live according to this philosophy that they spout. As much as they're always talking about the hypocrisy of Christians and stuff, the hypocrisy of religious believers. Excuse me, why are you going to a funeral? What's the point of this? Why are you mourning a mere natural process that you think is just the way it is? It's just evolution, man. So, and all I'm saying is that you don't actually live this way, right? I mean, you expect people to treat you the way you want to be treated. You expect moral injustices to not be done to you. But why? There's no universal standard. You may not like it, but there's nothing wrong with it. That's the point. So, that is going to be the approach that I have. Now, in my view, I'm going to say, all right, in knowledge, man has the ability, this is comparing the paradigms and contrasting them, man has the ability to know things about the world because he's made in God's image, right? So there's an omniscient mind that permeates the fabric of reality. The external world exhibits structure and form and geometric patterns and so forth precisely because of a creator, and therefore man in his mind is able to know and understand and interpret the world because he's made in the image of God, who's a personal God, not some impersonal force, but an actual personal God. So that's how he's able to know things, right? That's how he's able to have knowledge of universal claims, is because there's a mind with universal knowledge. That's how. So in my view, I have a basis for universals. The divine mind. In your view, there's no such thing as that. But you want to make a bunch of universal claims, which you can't do. In my view, metaphysics, I have a basis for belief in science and in the power of induction, right? Because of the regularity of nature, right? Because of providence, the doctrine of divine providence, the doctrine when God talks to Noah in Genesis 8, and he says that seasons will continue, regularity in nature. The covenant with Noah, and because of Genesis 1, is why I believe there's such a thing as regularity in nature, divine providence. Now, you may not like that, but I'm saying it makes sense in my view, within my paradigm, within my worldview. Man can interpret and engage in the process of induction, and there's regularity in nature because God structured a world such that he could do that. Tomorrow, the sun is not going to melt. Tomorrow, the sea's not going to turn into quicksand, and I'm not going to grow, floppy arms, and my head is not going to turn into the head of Bill Cosby because of regularity in nature. Why is there regularity in nature? because of providence. All science operates on the principle of induction and the assumption, presupposition, that there is regularity in nature. This is from David Hume. Now, since David Hume was consistent in his atheism, you should all atheists read David Hume, because you'll realize where you ought to go to be consistent. Hume says, atheists, let's be clear here, bros, brave bros, there's no basis for induction. You can't empirically prove induction or regularity in nature. It has to be assumed in the process of science. So there we have a huge logical truth and principle that's not empirically verified, that famous atheist philosophers have realized can't be demonstrated. By the way, Bertrand Russell in Scientific Outlook says David Hume was absolutely right. It can't be verified. We can't know that there's an external world. He says there's no solution to the problem of solipsism, Russell says. Here's the greatest logician of the 20th century, admitting that your view is so dumb that you can't even posit an external world. I have a rational belief in the external world because I believe I'm made in God's image and God created a world in which I inhabit and learn and move about in, right? So in my view, it makes sense why there's an external world. You can't even tell me if there is one, right? Go read Immanuel Kant, right? Kant is coming after Hume and saying, this leads to the problem of there being no external world. We can't know objects in themselves. Egads, what do we do? I guess we just have to give up on the idea of an external world. So once you understand how dumb your position is and how you are led into total foolishness, now we start to understand why the psalmist says, the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. This is what you're reduced to in your futile quest to try to disprove, and in your arrogance and pride, actually is what it amounts to, is the pride of man, to defy God, ultimately is what it amounts to. So that's my account for epistemology, right? And for metaphysics and there being an external world and objects in the world. The universe is permeated by the principle of logos. Objects, every molecule, every atom is permeated by logos, right? It has a logoi that is its meaning and predetermination and principle, as St. Maximus says. And ethically, I have a basis for ethics because I'm made in the image of a personal God, and he has a nature which is reflected in right and wrong morals. Okay, so to live in accord with him is to live in accord with the Ten Commandments and the principles in the Ten Commandments, and that makes perfect sense in a world structured by God, a personal God. Personal, relational, right? Some things will damage that relationship if you behave in a bad way, right? Just like between human beings. If you try to murder me, we're not going to have a good relationship. In the same way, it's relational with God. And so the Ten Commandments, these kinds of things, the teachings of Jesus, they're not in contrast, they're the same thing. These principles are good. They're given to us as moral law so that we can be healthy and live a fulfilling life. And when it's understood in that way, it makes perfect sense why in my world, in my paradigm, my worldview, these things make sense. So you may not like them, but at least I can give an account for why there's right and wrong. Now, so we compare these two paradigms and we see which one's coherent. That's my argument for God's existence. That's my proof. My position, the personal God of the Bible, is the only position that can give an account for rationality, for knowledge, for regularity in nature, metaphysics, and for right and wrong. The atheist position cannot do any of those, cannot give an account for either one of those things. And so it's false. That is the transcendental argument for God as it relates to the case of the atheist. Now, in the case of other religions or cults or sect, the argumentation will be a little bit different, but in many cases it might be the same. For example, against Far Eastern thought, Maya, solipsism, Hinduism, Buddhism, the argument will be very similar to this kind of to the atheist kind of approach. In the case of other monotheistic religions, it's going to be a little bit different with Judaism or Islam, where we're going to actually talk about the God itself that's being presented in that monotheism as a radically simple, unknowable entity or essence or force, an absolutely divine, simple monad. And we're going to show how that's self-refuting. But it's going to be similar to the way that the atheist is self-refuting, because in atheism, it always boils down to either some form of monism, which is philosophical nonsense, or a form of dualism. Right? So monism, pantheism, this is why you see guys like Dawkins out there actually promoting, saying, I'm basically a pantheist. I don't have a problem with pantheism. Right? Pantheism is nonsense. It's philosophically just as dumb as the other things that I've been arguing against, which maybe we'll do a talk on that eventually one day. But it's the same with Platonism too. Platonism falls into these same dialectical squabbles and nonsense. And so if you like this talk and you'd like to maybe get more, again, I cannot recommend this book enough, The Deification of Man, St. Gregory of Palamas in the Orthodox tradition, because he's going to show that the position that we come from is not merely intellectual. So to approach God, it's not a matter of like solving a bunch of equations. The only way to interpret the world correctly is also through repentance, right? So God gave man a faculty to know him directly, the nous, but because of the fall and because of our own sins in our life, we cloud that perspective and that nous, that proper paradigm for interpreting the world through our sinful actions. And so getting our hearts right, repenting and turning towards God, living according to divine law, those are the ways that we know God. All right. So in other words, there's no perfectly intellectual syllogism or math problem that's going to prove God to you until you turn from your egotism and your worship of self and rebellion against God. So you have to repent first before you can have new eyes to interpret the world. Otherwise, you're always going to be running in a circle with one leg nailed to the ground. So that is my basic response to how I would counteract an atheist, and a Nietzschean is basically an atheist too. We're just going to put those in the same category there for the sake of argument, and give an actual argument for God. So that is the transcendental argument for God in the case of arguing with an atheist, and it is a proof in the exact same way, by analogy, that Aristotle argued against the sophists with a transcendental argument, right, as it concerned the laws of logic or the law of non-contradiction, right? So I'm not saying that God is the law of non-contradiction. I mean, logical laws reflect God in his principles and his logos, but they're not exactly the same thing. God's not a law of non-contradiction. God's a personal, infinite, all-knowing, loving being, entity, person. And that's what this religion teaches, right? And that's what's so interesting, in that it sets it off against, be it Far Eastern paganism and Hinduism, Buddhism, and atheism, is that our ultimate principle is not some unknowable, meaningless absolute. It's a personal God that we have communion with. And as a result, many other things flow from this, and that's where we get into biblical theology, right? But this is the starting point, is, the question of how do we know this is true? What's the proof for God? Well, there you have it. That's a transcendental argument for the existence of God right there. Thank you for listening, and if you would, keep sharing, keep listening, and again, I'm trying to get to everybody's emails. I'm getting more and more emails these days. It's very difficult to keep up with them all. But thank you all, and God bless.